We have kind of an interesting topic today, I think. I hope everybody else does. Obviously, enough people showed up so that you must think so too. But the notion of performance improvement as design engineering is the topic. And one way to think about it, and as you'll see, this was inspired by conversations I had years ago with my late friend and colleague, Dr. Don Toasty, where he talked about the difference between proactive design and reactive problem solving. And the sort of graphic on the front of the slide here really is just kind of an effort to show sort of what continuous performance improvement as a design engineering strategy might look like. Um, anyway, I think we'll go to the slides here and go to the next one. So before we get into it, we are going to have some more webinars, as always. This current one is our 33rd. It's been almost 3 years now. We're going to talk at some point about Joe Harless's book, The Eden Conspiracy, because I think anybody who's interested in education or even where we are in America and elsewhere with respect to the products of our education will be interested in this. This is Joe Harless's book, The Eden Conspiracy, and some of the implications of that. We're also going to want to talk about one of the elements of performance thinking that we talk about criteria for a good work output or accomplishment. And and so what good looks like is a sort of a plain English way to talk about that. But we will be talking about the implications of it. And then we're going to talk about sales enablement at some point. So those are a few of the upcoming topics. The most immediate one next month on August 23rd that you can register for actually right now if you point your phone to that QR code is about box one in our 6 boxes model, aligning and communicating in expectations. And this has been a topic of interest to me for decades, really, because on 2 counts. One is that there are many people who think that Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model and our sort of revised or evolved version, plain English version of that, the 6 boxes model, applies only to individual performance. And I would strongly disagree with you because I think all of these factors exist at any level from society to organization to process to individual. Certainly, though, in box one, how we receive expectations and what those expectations are and whether they're aligned and consistent and clear, I think make an enormous impact on performance and even in our personal lives. So I think it's going to be a pretty interesting topic, and that's what we'll be doing next month. As you may know, we have we have a lot of material, a growing body of material on our YouTube channel at performancethinking.tv, and we always post our webinars there. And we also have some short playlists. And it's a really useful thing for people interested in communicating to stakeholders and to colleagues about performance improvement, because the longer webinars address different topics, some of the shorter playlists address things in smaller detail. The other thing is, again, many of you may know, we started some months ago starting to create these simple one-page study guides for our webinars. And we've done, I think, 7 of them at this point, and we've got another one coming out soon. And partly we've been moving our offices up until a few weeks ago, and that was quite a distraction in terms of time-consuming things. But we're putting out these free webinar study guides because some of our colleagues have started, for example, in chapters of ATD or ISPI or in academic environments, have started either to study the webinars themselves or to have study groups. And so those may be useful to you. Also, this will be recorded and put on YouTube. So for those of you who are watching it in a recorded version on YouTube, I really want to encourage you and ask you to help us out by subscribing and sharing this, because we want to get this out to as many people as we can. Now, as I mentioned, this topic has been a topic of interest of mine for a long time. And it really started back when our late colleague and really major thought leader in the field of performance improvement, Don Toasty, and I had some conversations in the early 2000s, and we actually did a talk some years ago in 2009, as you can see, before we renamed Binder Re Associates the Performance Thinking Network. And this was a white paper from it. And in fact, I am going to make this available right now. You should be able to download the white paper. And if you're watching the recording, you should be able to go on YouTube below the recording and get the link to it. But this was a conversation that I had with Don at various points in which I'll point out sort of some of the key points that he made, but it was a very interesting perspective. And so I want to credit Don with that, among many other things that he taught me. So the agenda for today is fairly straightforward. I want to talk a little bit about the evolution of human performance technology, human performance improvement, what people now call performance improvement, and how we got where we are now in some respects, and what Don's insights were about that. And one way to think about it is when you think about problem solving versus design engineering, are we trying to fix a bridge that's broken? Or are we trying to engineer and build and design a better bridge? And that's really the two options we have here: problem solving versus design engineering. And then I want to talk a little bit in very simple terms about how we use the models and logic of performance thinking as a design engineering framework, talk about a few examples, and then hopefully have some time for discussion. I see some of my friends and colleagues are here, including, I believe, if I look down the list here, including, are you still with us? Some folks who definitely knew Don very well. So first of all, let's talk about human performance improvement. Now, people call this different things, but if you go back to the origins of what really was called originally human performance technology, or HPT, you had people coming out of the instructional systems design, program instruction world. And what they were about was optimizing learning outcomes. They were trying to build training and education systems and programs that would enable people to learn as much as they can, as quickly as they can, basically, in simple terms. And it was very much of a systems approach because there were a lot of elements to making it work better. And the early pioneers in human performance technology, and I'll explicitly mention Gary Rumler and Tom Gilbert, but also Don Tosti was one of them, and a bunch of others. They sort of emerged from this field to create human performance technology when they kind of expanded the perspective to say, wait a minute, instruction or skills and knowledge are not the only variable here. In fact, there's a much more complex system we need to look at. And so what they began to talk about as human performance technology was kind of parallel to instructional technology, and it emerged really from instructional systems design. Now, the thing that Don turned me on to was the fact that in the, I guess it was probably 80s, plus or minus, maybe 90s even, but 70s or 80s, when the quality improvement thing came in, and when people started looking carefully at processes to eliminate defects coming off the end of assembly lines, there was sort of a shift from let's optimize the system to let's figure out why we get these defects and fix them. And so the field of human performance technology, if you will, drifted, and this is what Don's point to me was, away from really a design engineering approach, a systems approach, to problem solving, where we talked about root cause analysis of the problem, and then let's fix that. And then of course subsequently, and some of you may be more familiar with this terminology, human performance technology, which was how the International Society for Performance Improvement, which was really the home of this work in the early days, they framed it as performance technology, but people got confused about the word technology and so forth. And so the association, the society, whatever it was, American Society for Training and Development, which is now the Association for Talent Development, being a very good marketing organization, recognized that. And when they sort of cloned performance improvement, they called it HPI, or human performance improvement. That's a very high level discussion about how this all evolved. Now, here's something from one of Don's papers that I think is a fairly good way to lead into this. He said, understanding that every organization at its most basic level is a human performance system is critical for the success of virtually any attempt to improve or maintain performance. And then he says it's as important for every manager and every consultant to grasp this reality as it is for a medical doctor to recognize that the human body is, at its basic level, a biological system. In other words, you don't just fix one thing without looking at the implications. This is why we talk about drug interactions, why we talk about different effects of working on one part of the body versus the other part of the body. If we're good at it, we're looking at the whole system. And what he pointed out was too many so-called solutions in the field of performance have either failed or are short-lived, precisely because they fail to adequately address the people issues with a systems understanding. Now, that's a pretty bold statement that I think, once stated, is pretty obvious and clear. Two of the really important early contributors that I think represent this in many ways were Tom Gilbert and his highly, still taught in graduate schools, important book, Human Competence, Engineering Worthy Performance, and Gary Rumler. And they were and sometimes competitors, at one time business partners, but many people know Rumler's work. I always loved the subtitle here of his original book with Alan Brage, How to Manage the White Space in the Organization Chart. Let's look at the whole system. So these were two examples, really, in my view, of how things shifted, because these people started out as instructional technologists, really, to performance improvement. Now, Gilbert had a very interesting formula that he used to talk about, and he would say that the worth of an intervention to improve performance is equal to the value of the accomplishments that it increases or, adds, divided by the cost of behavior. And this is a pretty powerful idea, because we've probably all been involved in things like training programs, for example, where it wasn't completely obvious that they produced a lot of increase in accomplishments, and maybe they didn't even. And yet they were pretty costly. It was costly to design, to develop, to deliver, to take people off the job, and so forth. Now, these days, so Tom was saying we should look at our interventions to optimize this, because we don't want to produce interventions that are more costly than the payoff. Now, in current terminology, people would probably talk about this as return on investment. In other words, if we're going to optimize the return on our investment in people, we better be sure that we increase accomplishments and optimize cost. So that's a fairly simple thing that has kind of implications for systems, really. So what we're trying to do, again, is maximize value and optimize cost. Now, Gilbert had another idea that I've taken to heart very much, and I can see that at least one person from Exemplary Performance is here, which is the notion of looking at exemplary performance. Now, Tom, this is a kind of a representation of the way he spoke about it. If you look at an organization, the assumption is that there's something like a bell curve. Now, it isn't really always a bell curve, of course, but in other words, there's some stars. There's some really exemplary performers who produce results or accomplishments at levels that are highly productive and high quality, considerably better in many cases than average. And then, of course, there's some people at the bottom who struggle and who may be costly and maybe HR spends a lot of money with, but there's a vast number of average performers. And what Tom Gilbert pointed out, and he called it the potential for improving performance, was that if you look at a hunk of performance with a team or an organization or a bunch of individuals, whatever, a group of people or groups who are performing, if there is a substantial difference between the average level of performance and the stars, that is the greater that is, the more likely it is that you can produce an improvement. And we renamed this the upside potential because it was pointed out to us some years ago that PIP, which Tom meant as potential for improving performance, these days often means performance improvement plan, which is what HR does, before they lead somebody at the door often. And so that had kind of a negative vibe. So we refer to it as the upside potential. But in any case, the notion here is if we're looking at a whole team or organization or, group, and we can raise the average even a bit, 10, 15%, ideally, in an exemplary performer analysis, by identifying what things the stars, the top performers do that are different than people that make a big difference. And we can sort of promulgate that, train that, support that, and optimize conditions. If we can raise the average just even that much, that can be worth a lot in dollars, in customer satisfaction, market share, and so forth. So again, this is kind of a systems view. This is not looking at just the person or whatever. This is saying, let's look at the whole system, identify what behavior, perhaps exemplary performers use to perform super well, and then arrange conditions in such a way that we can increase the overall performance of that organization. Now, if you look at the ISPI's human performance technology model, which I think it's probably still on the ISPI website, it certainly was for a long time, you see this model that I've often, frankly, used as a bit of a whipping boy or straw man or whatever, because it has everything you can imagine. I sometimes refer to it as the everything, including the kitchen sink model. And this is kind of the framework that ISPI has taught for years. And so the question is, what is it really about? Well, if you look in there, you see a whole thing about gap analysis. And gap analysis, the way using that word even, does not imply potential for improving performance or upside potential. It implies a problem. And so people talk about root cause analysis, where they're trying to figure out what the source of that problem is. And of course, in process and quality improvement, that's a big deal because you're trying to eliminate those defects. But this is where the topic of, do we want to just fix the bridge, or do we want to build a better bridge comes up. Now, some people use root cause analysis, as I mentioned, to address these gaps. So like, what behavior influences are causing the gap in performance? And we actually have colleagues around the world who use our 6 boxes model, which are the labels you see on the bones of this fishbone or Ishikawa diagram, where people are trying to figure out what's wrong here. How come we're getting defects? But you could think about it differently. And as Gary Rumler said, I love this quote. He said, when we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it's hitched to everything else in the universe. That's about as systemic a view as you can get. And so the notion is, what if we looked at this and said, we're not just looking for the problem. We don't want to just plug the hole in the dike. We want to build a better dike. So if we do an analysis of the whole system and try to optimize and align these conditions, the probability is that we can do a better job in terms of ROI, sustainment, and so forth. And this goes back to Don Tosti's comment about how these sort of point solutions often don't sustain, or they don't certainly produce the optimal return on investment. So here's an explicit statement, again from Don, about how problem solving limits us. He says, defining human performance technology or performance improvement as a process that begins with root cause analysis limits us in the applications we use, in terms of where we look for factors that impact results, in the perceived value to clients, and in the kinds of issues clients are willing for us to work on. It's like a dog holding onto a bone. We're just going to look at the problem and solve it. But then, as he says, defining HPT as beginning with desired results or value analysis, and then looking for means to achieve those results or that value, has the potential to broaden our range and our impact. And Dr. Tosti also talked about innovation coming out of a design, more of a design and systems approach. So I think this is another hint about what the challenges are and why we might want to prefer a more systemic design engineering approach to a approach focused on gap analysis and problem solving. So what I would say is that the goal of design engineering, when applied to performance improvement, is to optimize human performance to achieve the maximum return on investment. Everybody talks about ROI, and the way you're going to get ROI is make all the parts work together as efficiently, optimally as possible, not just by fixing one of the parts. So I want to lay out a little bit about how we think of this from the point of view of performance thinking. And many of you, I can see people's names, many of you who are quite familiar with the models of performance thinking. So unlike lots of these webinars, I'm not going to take you through the whole logic of it, but we are going to talk about these models. So for starters, when we look at an organization and any hunk of performance, whether it's in an individual, a team, a process, even at the organizational relationship map level, what we would argue with our first simple model of performance chain is that there's basically 3 elements we're looking at. First thing is we want to know what the organizational or business results are that are at stake. And so the items under there, of course, are examples of organization-wide business or organizational results. And sometimes we're looking at societal results, but let's talk about the organization for starters. And once we know what we're trying to achieve, that puts us in a place to look at the system or to look at the hunk of performance that we're examining with that in mind. Because, for example, if we're trying to increase market share, but don't so much care about profitability at this point, we may do, as they say, offer loss leaders. We may say, we're going to sell our products just like Ford and Chevrolet are now doing in the electric vehicle market. Every vehicle they sell, they're losing money on because they're trying to capture some market share so they can compete with Tesla, which of course has not only the biggest market share, but also is profitable with every vehicle they sell. So if market share is what we're going for, that may affect how we do everything else, as one example of knowing what's at stake. Once we know that, then we take a look at whatever the hunk of performance is, organizational level, process level, individual level, and we say, what are the accomplishments or work outputs of all kinds that are important, that are valuable because they contribute to the business results. Once we do that, we're in a very strong position to look at the activity, the behavior that produces them. And then those are the three elements of performance. And so now we take a look at behavior influences. But of course, as you well know, behavior influences can be a super long list of stuff. So we need some way to deal with that. And Tom Gilbert's behavior engineering model, which in the 80s we tweaked until we had plain English language that people, user testing showed people understood, produced this. It said, these are the variables. These are the categories, the functions, if you will, that define all the things that may affect behavior and therefore performance. And of course, expectations and feedback is the first thing, because we don't know what we're trying to produce and we don't know how we're doing. The rest of it's not going to make too much difference. And then all of the tools and resources are all the things that enable us to perform in real time, not just screwdrivers and software, but also the right ventilation, the right job design, having people available, all of those resources we need to do the thing now. And then consequences and incentives, whether explicit or inexplicit, whether intended or unintended. And then in the individual or the person, there's skills and knowledge that people may need. And then we select and assign people based on their capacity. And then we need to understand motives and preferences if we're going to select people and motivate them. So this is a framework for all the variables that affect performance. And I would argue that it's a system, and that this is a good way to look at the system. And this is where I push back a little bit on those people who claim that Gilbert's model or our evolution of it is just for individuals. It's not. Every single one of those variables can be looked at a global level, for that matter. What are our expectations about what Vladimir Putin's going to do? Well, that has an effect on us, and it has an effect not only on the individuals, but also on the governments, on everybody else. And you could make exactly the same argument of all these things. So we would argue that this is a very simple, elegant, complete framework for looking at the functions that various things serve in relationship to behavior. And it's a system. And they all have to link together, because if they don't connect up, if, for example, you change expectations a whole bunch, but you're still rewarding people for the same old stuff, consequences and incentives, you may not get the results you need. And this goes back to Dr. Tosti's point that if you just fix one of these things without looking at the other ones, you may not really get the results you need. And we know we can look at behavior influences in a positive way, and we call them enablers. These are all the things. This is our best effort back many years ago to try to summarize what fits into that framework at the highest level with the shortest number of bullet points. And we can also look at the negative stuff. We can look at the obstructions, the things that get in the way of performance or that have a negative impact. We can even do it, as we have, and we talk about this in the context of employee engagement, because this is also linked to the Gallup engagement poll. We can also look at it in terms of what leaders and managers do to arrange conditions for their people. And again, these things have to be aligned and integrated and coordinated, or they're just going to bump into each other, and you're not going to have an effective system or an optimal ROI. And so our logic, again, as people know, is we just sort of paste these two models together and we say, what's at stake in this project or coaching this person or in this 3-year initiative that we're doing in the company? What are we trying to achieve now, and what do we care about? All right, now, what are the accomplishments or the work outputs? And are we sure they contribute to business results or organizational results? Once we got that, we say, okay, what's the behavior needed to produce that? And that's where we might interview and observe exemplary performers. We might do task analysis. There's a lot of ways we might identify the behavior, but it's behavior for producing those work outputs at the highest levels of quality and such. And then we got a framework for measurement, because those are the three things we can measure. And we can talk about what data are available and what we might use to make timely decisions, what are leading indicators, what are lagging indicators, but we can at least identify what's possible to measure. And then we do our little design thinking bit, which is we take the 6 boxes framework and we say, with respect to the behavior that is producing those accomplishments or work outputs, we first analyze. We say, what's working in each cell of this model? What's positive? What's negative? And then we say, well, there's some things missing, or there's some negatives in here. How might we fix those? And this is, the design thinking people call this ideation. But the idea is to do more than just the usual suspects, to think of all the ways we might be able to provide information on the job, maybe paper job aids, maybe online tools, maybe micro-learning, maybe having a manager who can help us right in the spot. There's lots of ways we might be able to address some of these issues. So let's have a robust brainstorm exercise. And then let's choose or configure the behavior influences in such a way that we work with our stakeholders to be sure that this works for them, so to speak, and we align these things in the most cost-effective way. So that's the logic we apply. And we see this as a design engineering approach, because it's not just solving a problem with a solution. It's actually, it may be solving a problem, but ideally it's optimizing performance in some way that's cost-effective. So this is how it works. And of course, the language, we believe, helps a lot. That's why we developed the plain language here, because we find we can collaborate across groups and so forth. And this is kind of the representation of that. We've taught this approach in our performance thinking practitioner program, which certifies performance consultants, but we've also taught leaders and managers to coach their teams and their individuals. We've done a whole lot of things with kind of people at any level in any organization to embed this way of looking at, approaching, analyzing, and optimizing performance. And so that's kind of how performance thinking is a design engineering thing. And one of the beauties of it, of course, is that we can engage and have engaged people from all these different functions and more. In fact, when I look at the list of all the folks here, I know a lot of you, and you are in different roles. Many of you are performance improvement or training people, but there's some folks, there's a error reduction expert here. There's a change management expert here. There's some people coming from different angles and can all apply this. So let's talk about a few examples. And this is going to be a short webinar, and I'm hoping we'll have some conversation with people because we're at a half hour right now, and I've probably got another 10, 15 minutes max. So, for example, I've worked in a lot of call centers, and I've worked with teams that did. And you can, if you have a call center and people say, well, we're having kind of unhappy customers here, we need to fix this. But what are you going to do? Well, what's the problem? Well, maybe the problem is people don't know what they're talking about. So you say, okay, well, we need to improve training here, or we need to do something. Well, how about if instead we look at the whole system? We see not just how the individuals are performing, but we see what their working relationship is with the supervisors or the leads. We optimize the tools. We do improve training and practice, etc. Well, we did that, for example, at AT&T Wireless, and we were able to reduce the time to benchmark performance, which used to take 2 months to get new customer service reps to 2 weeks. And not only that, but after those first 2 weeks, they increased their productivity 60% higher than the benchmark in the organization. And I swear we would not have accomplished that had we not looked at the whole system. So that's one example. Another example is early on, a lot of the early work that I was involved in, and my team's folks back in the 80s and early 90s, was about sales knowledge in salespeople. And we worked with companies on product launches, like Microsoft and Genentech. We worked with big companies like Oracle and such, insurance companies, all kinds of big companies, where we were either preparing people for product launches, or we were going in and trying to sort of fix some issues. And again, you could do some knowledge training that was, specific to fix a knowledge gap. But you can also provide practice. You can enable managers to serve as coaches. You can give people better tools. You can, et cetera. You can do a whole set of things. You can improve their reference materials using information mapping so that they can find stuff quickly. And so, again, we were able to do in many companies. We had people in banks saying, these kids have only been, in training for 2 weeks and they know more stuff than I do and they're better at it than I am. And I've been doing this for 5 years. And so we could optimize this by not just doing better training, but looking at all the variables. Or, for example, this was a kind of an interesting one. And I bet you some of you have seen this in organizations where we had a sales organization and the marketing department would produce materials and programs that they expected the salespeople to use in the field. And these things were dead on arrival in many cases because, the salespeople would get them and they say, I can't do this. This won't work. Well, it was really a simple process thing. It was a process thing whereby we could rearrange expectations and the processor for flow of information. So first of all, there was an explicit way for people in the field to make suggestions and requests about the kinds of marketing programs and materials they might need or want to help them in certain parts of their sales process. But we also then could have a feedback loop that was earlier in the system so that even if marketing people came up with some idea and they say, okay, we're going to do this, pretty early on, they would test it out with the salespeople and say, what do you guys think? Is this going to be helpful? Now, that's a trivial kind of intervention in a certain way, but it made an enormous difference because it eliminated friction. It almost became, an enemy thing between the marketing people. And another example, medical devices firm, really in the realm of exemplary performance and best practice. And we did this in a lot of companies. The early one, back in like early 2000s, we didn't go in and do some sales training because, as many of you might know, if you've ever been in this enablement world, a lot of companies just sort of dump a whole lot of training on their people about products and features, and then also about spin selling or whatever the month is. Don't actually analyze and look in detail about what the successful sales process is in their organization, for their market, for their product. And so that's the approach we take to sales enablement. We go in and we interview and observe people, and we really nail down the large and small milestones that salespeople are actually trying to achieve. New introductions, positive relationship with receptionist who will let me into the back to the doc. A whole bunch of things which are accomplished. Once you have that, you have the whole system, or at least the outputs of it. Conditions, you can expectation, and provide feedback. You can do built around that. You can practices from some of your star. You do a whole, but your overall analysis system optimizing, and that can make a big difference. Here's one. This was simply performable, but it was a big chip manufacturer. This is a long time ago, and I was engaged to do performance analysis people in their or chip manufacturing environment, and there was these machines for crank would get by service tech was mean time between fail. That is, you do your standard maintenance, change the pair part, adjust things, so forth, and then you see if it's going to last and work quite optimally until the next you do that, or leaking fluids or chips in it or whatever. And what we learned was that there were a few maintenance techs who did the work. It was not a problem. the machine was just fine until the time. But most of them, that wasn't true. So I and a team of people observed these guys doing, mechanical machines, and we discovered small bits of behavior made a huge difference that weren't written down any place in the documentation that made a big difference. You could look at the whole process, identify exemplary behavior, and build training and documentation and feedback and supervision around that. So that's another example. And then in a behavioral health organization, that this was actually one of my colleagues did that at a performance thinking practitioner project. But this was a situation with a big behavioral health financial service company in the East Coast, people with various kinds of disabilities, and a lot of residences, and they had a whole fleet of buses, and they needed to get their staff people, their residents, with the right stuff at the right time, picked up at the right place and delivered to the right place on time. And so you could have approached this and just say, well, we're going to fix the scheduling conflict problem. But instead, the folks looked at the whole process, they defined it in detail, and they found a whole lot of opportunities to improve it. And it wasn't just a scheduling problem. There were other issues too around maintenance and so forth. And so this was an example where standing back and looking at it, instead of saying, well, we're just going to fix the scheduling thing, they were able to optimize the results. So those are some classic examples. My bet is, looking at who's here, that some of you have some actually more impressive examples of taking a systems-wide design engineering approach. So here was Don's sort of last comment. This is in a slide set that he had, but he said, perhaps it's time to take down the old human performance technology sign, we find the root cause of your deficiencies and fix them, and change it to, we provide innovative ways to help you create more value for your stakeholders. So that's kind of the, if you will, the punchline from Don's point of view, and I think it's consistent with what I'm suggesting as well. So here's some takeaways, and then we will have plenty of time if you're up for some Q&A and sharing examples and such. First thing is just to remember that the origins of the performance improvement field really were in structural systems design, looking at to optimize results, not just to sort of fix gaps. And then the second thing is that if we follow along with that, and if we take the same path as the early performance improvement folks did, we want to optimize the system. We want to maximize the return on investment by looking at the whole system. And then, as Dr. Tosti pointed out, if we just focus on the problem and fixing it, that may help in manufacturing environments. It may help in strict, process environments where we're trying to eliminate the defects. And if we take lean, a sort of Toyota production system headset, and we say, we're going to keep doing that until we get rid of all the problems, that's a kind of an iterative systems approach. And you could talk about it as a design engineering approach in a way from the bottom up. And I'm sure Tony could say interesting things about that. There's a few other folks here who have some background. But I think Don's point was, if you focus in any given instance on just root cause analysis and fixing that cause, there may be a whole lot of other stuff that could have been improved that aren't even attended to. And then I hopefully pointed out how our approach, simple as it might seem, is a design engineering approach. How, particularly when we get, once we've defined the accomplishments and why they're important that we want to address, then we take a look at the behavior for producing them, and we go through this design thinking, analyze, brainstorm, or ideation, if you want to call it, and choose behavior influences. So we really are, it's not unlike a literal product engineering effort. We have a lot of prototypes, and you figure out, what's possible, and then you configure the thing based on what you've learned. And then another aspect of this is that if we are just sort of specialists parachuting into an organization, whether we work for that organization or we're an external consultant, and sort of fixing a problem, sort of showing up and fixing it and then moving on, That's a very different thing than if we can engage the stakeholders. Because when we leave, it's going to be the managers, supervisors, leaders, and others who actually set expectations, provide feedback, ensure that the tools are working, recognize excellent performance. And so if we can engage those stakeholders and those participants from the beginning as our partners, which of course is one of the standards of that ISPI promotes as part of performance consulting, performance improvement, partnering, then it's more likely that we can really do a systems-wide design engineering approach. And I would argue that the 21 plain English words and 2 simple pictures of performance thinking enable us to do that, because we can get people on board thinking this way pretty quickly in most cases. And so what I would say is that we can think about this as design engineering for continuous improvement. So that's really most of what I have to say here. I want to do a little shameless commerce here, which is that we deliver our performance thinking practitioner program, which is a certification program for performance consultants, to big companies. You know, we've got one biotech, our biggest, longest biotech company has over 300 certified practitioners all over the globe. We have a lot of companies that have developed a team or two, like Meta and so forth. But we also we're starting a new one with what I think is the largest delivery service in the world. But we also have an open program that we do several times a year. And our next one that anybody can sign up for. And our next one is September 11th. And I think as of my last check, I think there were 3 seats left in that. So if there's anybody here who's interested or who has colleagues interested in learning a plain English approach to performance improvement, here's the information, and you can actually use that QR code with your phone to see the information about it. And then for the open program, I always like to talk to individuals who are going to be in it to be sure it's a good fit and they know what to expect and so forth. That's one thing. And then the second thing is we've had a coaching program for years, because what we recognized was there's a lot more managers than there are performance professionals. And in the end, when we leave the scene, it's going to be the managers and the supervisors who really arrange conditions for performance. So we have a coaching program that teaches people to apply performance thinking to individuals, helping them improve their capacity or their ability to produce work outputs or accomplishments, whether they're the ones that are currently needed, for some upcoming project, for the next steps in their career path, and so forth. And so when COVID hit, most of the companies that were doing this kind of stopped, because we not only taught the course, but also it typically would happen, coaching would happen, in person. And so we had some very large clients who just stopped delivering the program during COVID. And we recognized we needed to turn it into a virtual program. And so we have redesigned it, and it's still very pilot level. And so at some point in the next couple months, we've got a bunch of people who are interested in being certified to deliver our coaching program. So we're going to have a pilot program of this, probably in the September timeframe. And if you're interested, you can email us at info@sixboxes.com. You can check out the information about that program, because we're kind of excited about it. We want to be sure that this works. So we'll be doing a pilot program. It will be highly reduced cost for this particular run, because we're going to ask participants at various points to give us feedback and suggestions for improvement. So that's another upcoming thing. And as I mentioned, the study guides thing, these are the ones I think that we've produced so far. We're going to keep doing, because these webinars, and there are a lot giving us feedback from all over the globe about this is really a lot of free stuff. What we'd like to do is help people identify the key points, and if they're in with other folks, interesting conversations about it. So we produce these free study guides, and if you're interested, you can give us your email address, and we promise not to bomb you with spam. It's a separate, it'll be separate from our spam bombing emails, let's put it that way. So that's really what I have to say here. I'm gonna open up the chat page to see if anybody has questions or comments. So this is good. Okay, so Jamie had to drop off. Bandwidth issues. Oh, there were bandwidth issues. Okay. So I'm just looking at here. So Tony asks, how do we address behavior influences from an organizational system considering systems thinking learning? Well, this is we could probably have an extended conversation about the Tony. But what I know is that if we're looking at a particular thing, outputs of some kind, and we're seeing opportunities from, and we talk to performers, or we observe performers, and they say, well, you know, the policy around here says this, but my supervisor is saying that, and at a time he gave to this, it all up. Simple example would say that in that one expectation, you would say these things all line up across, and this goes software, there are tools and resources different groups use, and they're all over the place. Too many of them, user interfaces. Well, one of the higher, recommendations to make would, let's take this and try to understand, maybe we should consolidate into a system, maybe we should, etc. So just an example off the top of my head, but the way I think about organizations is that some people have different names for behavior at different levels of the organization. Like Gilbert, as you probably know well, had his level advantage. But if you look at those, they're just different names for expectations, resources, or recognition, or whatever, depending on what level you're at. So I don't know if that answers your question, Tony, but that's how I think of it. I remember having a conversation with our colleague, Carol Penza, probably 15 years ago. And Carol certainly did a lot of organizational work in her career. She said, oh, yeah, this is at every level. And so that was, at that time, that was very confirmatory for me, because that's what I always thought. But that's how we think about it. And then if you combine that, of course, with process analysis, or with whatever level of analysis of the outputs you need, whether it's an organizational relationship map where we're talking about the things that are passed around between the different departments and functions, or whether we're talking about a process where we define the steps, but we insist that each step has a defined output so we can measure it, count it, see if it's good, and diagnose, or if it's the individual level. As long as we do the analysis at the right level, then we can look at those behavior influences. So I don't know if that helps, Tony, but that's my response. So hi, Yvonne. It's nice to see you. I'm sorry if you're having bandwidth issues. Oh, geez. Okay. Oh, so it's a bandwidth problem. I didn't see this. Oh, man. I'm sorry. I'm just looking at other things. So any more comments or questions? So Tony, is that satisfying? I see you say thanks, but I'm wondering if my response to that is sort of satisfying. I've never done this before, but we have a few minutes. I could set this up so we could try talking, although if we have bandwidth problems, that might make it worse. So maybe I shouldn't do that. What do you think? Anyone else have comments or questions? Well, because I was deep into the slides, I didn't notice that you were having bandwidth issues. I'm sorry about that. It's always a little bit hard to tell where they're happening. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. If we're done, yeah, that would be great, Tony. I appreciate that. If we're done, I appreciate your time and your interest in this work, and I hope you'll come to the next one too, because I think box one is actually that is expectations and feedback, is a great opportunity to talk about levels in the organization, because so often, I mean, here's a classic example, just to maybe extend this a little bit. I remember being in a sales meeting at one of the larger software companies, and the VP of whatever the product group was up in the front, and there were hundreds of salespeople in the room. And the VP was announcing this new important product, this software product they had that was sort of an enterprise-wide product, and was saying, this is strategic. You need to get this into your client organizations because it'll be a big leverage for us to do blah, 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 the whole story about this product. And so I was kind of semi in the back of the room, and there were a couple of real experienced sales reps next to me. And one of them says, he pulls out the thing, and he says, well, I just got the comp plan this morning. He says, I don't see anything in this comp plan about this product. It's a heck of a lot easier for me to make my numbers based on what I already know how to sell than it is to go the effort of selling this big thing. That was a simple example of where expectations expressed by the VP and expectations represented in the comp plan for consequences were not aligned. And here's another example of a systems thing where in a behavioral health organization, there was a concern about relationships between the therapists who were working with children and families who were diagnosed with autism. And it was important, said the supervisors, to develop good relationships with the parents. But if you looked at billable time and what insurance would reimburse, you didn't get paid for having time with parents. And so there was this conflict between essentially a policy and an expectation from supervisors. So guess what happened? They didn't spend much time with parents. So there's a lot of examples like that where you have conflicting behavior influences, where if you look up and down the system, you will find ways to align them. Anyway, with that, I think I'll close. Thanks everybody for your participation, and hopefully I'll see you next month. And this will be posted, by the way, and you'll get a follow-up email in a couple days. It'll make it to the webinar playlist on YouTube. So thank you.